Second largest of the Channel Islands, Guernsey is a tranquil haven lying off the French coastline, where France meets England in a curious mix of language and custom, a gentle climate with friendly locals, and where life carries on peacefully as it has done for hundreds of years. But this wasn't always the story. In such a setting, it's easy to forget the Channel Islands was the only British territory occupied by Germany during World War II. And aspects of those dark days have been preserved behind the walls of this small cottage, where back in 1990, on the 45th anniversary of liberation, these islanders recalled life under Nazi occupation, surrounded by the collection of one man. Richard Hume, MBE, is the owner and curator of Guernsey's stunning German occupation museum.
I've been collecting things all my life. As a schoolboy, I used to go behind the tractor and plough looking for clay pipes I used to collect as a young boy. I collect things relating to the occupation. All the exhibits in the museum have actually come from Guernsey. And there are some things from Alderney and Sark, and one or two smaller items from Jersey. My mother has been the greatest source of inspiration to me because she and my father were here in the occupation and they kept things, and it was the things that they kept which initially interested me in collecting. Perhaps the most unusual exhibit in the museum is this most peculiar thing, which is a horse's gas mask. The two cones actually go up the horse's nostrils, believe it or not. The only occasion when it was done for practice at a local stable, the horse actually bolted, so it can't have been too good.
Once part of the Duchy of Normandy, the Channel Islands came to Britain under William the Conqueror and have remained loyal to the Crown ever since. Through centuries of conflict, they were fortified against French raiders, and today you can find examples of medieval castles, Napoleonic Martello towers, and Victorian forts. But in September 1939, the world was drawn into another global war as Adolf Hitler unleashed his new armies against Poland. Frank Strubant, a famous Guernsey sportsman before the war, wrote about his occupation experiences and shared them with us in 1990.
We felt that we had to go or give some help to Poland, which were really being persecuted. So I think that we were very much in favour. We were a little bit reserved about how it would affect us. Quite honestly, the First World War we got away with very well. We thought we would probably get away with the Second World War. And so it seemed for the 12 months of the phony war, when nothing happened at all, and there didn't seem to be a war on.
Raymond Fowler had a thriving horticultural business when war broke out.
Well, I think most of us thought that we were going to carry on quietly exporting our produce to England and living normally.
In May 1940, this phony war was shattered when Hitler then hurled his armour westward in a terrifying blitzkrieg against France and the Low Countries. In a swift, crushing campaign, Germany swept the survivors of the British Expeditionary Force backwards to the Channel at Dunkirk. Then it was only a matter of time before the swastika flew over Paris and the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS paraded in triumph down the Champs-Élysées.
Heiß von 100.000 Leib
As their commanders took the salute in Paris, the new German garrisons consolidated their hold on the French coastline. And as their sentries gazed across at the Channel Islands, the question was asked, when would Hitler make his next move?
The first effort they made was a reconnaissance, and I happened to be standing by the window of the Home from Home restaurant, which I had opened at the time, and this plane came in, just skimmed over the water, and then shot up. And from that moment on, we did expect something.
Having demilitarised the Channel Islands, the British government in London decided in June 1940 to provide ships for those who wanted to leave. But panic set in as families were faced with an agonising choice: to leave their island homes or stay and face the unknown. Herbert Winterflood, chief reporter on the Guernsey Evening Press in 1990, was just a young lad at the time.
I decided that it was perhaps best for me to stay with my family, and we would travel to England en bloc. And we were going to do this, but on the Friday in June, when the Germans bombed St. Peter Port Harbour, there was little opportunity after that to leave the island.
Molly B.A., author of A Child's War, was another of Guernsey's children who stayed behind.
The boats started to come eventually, and the families, some families did go together. The school children went mainly without their parents, and this was causing my mother a lot of worry. Down at the harbour it was, "Don't be yellow, stay." There was big notices and placards up. There was other people saying, "You go." My mother and father was phoning people, "Are you going or are you staying?" Nobody knew what to do.
Then, on June the 28th, the Germans struck as Luftwaffe bombers from their French airfields flew low over the islands. Frank Strubant saw what happened.
It became obvious to us that we were going to be occupied when they raided the harbour, and attack they did. We lost 30-odd people. As far as I was concerned, we were extremely lucky. All our windows were blown in. The cafe was full, but the air raid wardens and myself were able to get all the people down into the cellar, which was more or less a death trap if it had been hit directly. But we were able to survive that lot. And then once the air raid was over, everybody moved out of town.
I was in Elizabeth College, right at the top of it, and saw the bombing, and was one of the last people to telephone to the ministry.
Am bekanntesten sind die Inseln Jersey und Guernsey. Hier betraten im Sommer 1940 deutsche Truppen zum ersten Mal in diesem Kriege englischen Boden.
By the Sunday, the Germans had landed at the airport, and the next day were in full occupation of the island.
Auf englischem Boden deutsche Truppen im Parademarsch an ihrem Kommandeur vorbeimarschieren.
First time I saw Germans was being summoned out of my bed at midnight and asked, "Are you the man who put 240 head of cattle on the airport?" And I said yes, and they summoned me to the Royal Hotel and told me to have them moved by daylight the following morning or be shot.
My mother was so frightened, and I think it instilled into us that we were very frightened to go out at first. Mum didn't go out for 3 months. We as children used to do her shopping. I suppose because before the war we didn't talk about or didn't see pictures of foreign people like we do now, and my mother sort of thought they were going to be squareheads and just didn't know what they were going to be looking like.
When the officers' cars drove up, well, then we went out and had a look. And there was a limited number of them. It didn't create any great disturbance. We knew it was coming, and we just accepted that they were there.
The High Command initially shipped in small units from the Wehrmacht, and they behaved in a correct military fashion. For this first German garrison, the summer of 1940 was a paradise. The shops were full of food and there were gifts to send back home. It was a time to relax and enjoy their victory. But soon the shadow of Nazi rule was cast across the islands as military permits began to regulate all aspects of everyday life. Though on Guernsey, civil affairs were left in the hands of a controlling commission, on which Raymond Faller served.
My specific job was to organise the production of food, both under glass and outdoors.
Our island was equipped for growing tomatoes, and the population lived on tomatoes until they looked like a tomato.
Fearing a British counterattack, German High Command in Berlin ordered in heavy armour for the island's defences, including the feared Flak 88s, later used to deadly effect in other theatres of operation.
When they came, they were really cock-a-hoop, and I could understand it. And they did send the elite here to pacify and to try, if possible, to create a relationship, because they thought that their next stepping stone would have been the mainland and the conquest of England. And in fact, some of the earlier troops came, and when they used to look north, which was actually Alderney, the local population, you would tell them that was the Isle of Wight and that was their next step. And to a great degree, they believed it. They also went through a period where the Navy was mostly used to Baltic seas, and they used to come in the harbour and tie up with about a foot of rope, and there was a 30-foot tide, and their craft used to get left hanging on the harbour wall, and it was a great joke. But it didn't become a joke when they threatened punishment for anybody who didn't sort of tell them about it.
To the north of Guernsey, the island of Alderney had been completely evacuated, so when the Germans arrived and found it abandoned, they had a free hand. Military historian Colin Partridge lives on Alderney and has made extensive studies of the island's German fortifications.
The German Air Force played a considerable role in the defence, the permanent defence of the islands. In the first year of the war, there were flying units stationed here in support of the German assaults on Britain. For the first 18 months of the occupation, there was very little in the way of permanent fortification at all. Naturally, the airfield and the harbours were defended by mobile batteries, but it was not until the middle of 1941, with the German attack on Russia, that any serious fortification building was contemplated. At that time, the 319th Infantry Division was brought to the islands with a number of batteries, and in successive months, orders were issued in detail for the permanent fortification of the islands. With the abandonment of Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of England, and the entry of Germany into Russia, Hitler naturally became concerned for the exposure of the continental coast. And it was at this time that the serious fortification building was contemplated.
Der Chef der UT, Reichsminister Speer, bei der Besichtigung einer der Großbaustellen. Führt das Werk weiter, das Reichsminister Dr.
At the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, the organisation Todt was employed in the construction of fortifications along the Atlantic Wall and here in the Channel Islands. There was some 20,000 members of the organisation Todt here. The overseers of this organisation wore this khaki-style uniform, whereas the press-ganged workers and labourers wore their own civilian clothes.
Forced labour was drafted in from all occupied countries of Europe, as diverse as Moroccans who'd been found in North Africa, Spanish Republicans, other political prisoners who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a considerable number, of course, from Russia were brought to the coastline to work on the fortifications.
Dr. Trevor Davenport also settled on Alderney, and he too became involved in the study of the German defences. And back in 1990 he spoke of the foreign workers Germany shipped to his island.
To house these labourers, 4 camps were built by volunteer Frenchmen, and they were completed in 42 in 6 months. It is estimated between 3,000 and 4,000 labourers were imported to Alderney. We're now standing outside the gates of Lager Sylt, which is the only concentration camp built by the Germans on British soil. It housed mostly political prisoners and was the smallest of the camps. But in March 1943, SS Bau Brigade 1 took it over for a period of about 14 months. When they eventually left, the place was actually destroyed by the Germans.
Conditions for those slave labourers were extremely harsh, and Richard Hume created a special display in his museum devoted to those civilian builders of the German fortifications.
Many of them didn't have footwear, and they had to improvise with makeshift footwear and wooden shoes. Some of them were very badly treated, and we have here an actual authentic whip which was taken off one of the overseers in Guernsey after being seen hitting workers.
This striking memorial to the slave workers who died on Alderney was later erected by a local family. And known as the Hammond Memorial, its plaques commemorate myriad nationalities.
I think you have to see the fortifications of the Atlantic Wall as the final phase of a form of construction which can be traced back to the German Festa of the 1870s, 1880s. Every point of detail in the bunkers which you see on the shoreline today, that can be traced back to those works. You can trace the design through the concrete works on the Hindenburg line of the First World War, and of course these are redeveloped with great enthusiasm in the 1930s by the German Army Ordnance designers and developed to a fine pitch on the Atlantic Wall. The towers, of course, are a very salient feature of the 2 principal islands. Only one similar structure is present in Alderney. There's perhaps one very unique work in Guernsey, that is the Naval Fire Direction Post at L'Angle. This has obvious visual allusions to the conning tower of a capital ship. This tower is quite obviously one of the most prominent landmarks of the occupation, Richard, and it's to be hoped that we can ensure its preservation. These towers were built in the earlier stages of the German occupation, and it was part of a system for the artillery defence laid down by the army, the long base range finding system, where you have towers set up at measured distances along the coast, and each level of the tower, each platform on adjoining towers, spots for a particular battery. Germans, against all known procedures, preferred to pour their concrete continuously. So having laid down the concrete base slab, the shuttering and the reinforcement would then be erected for the remaining sections of the building, and it would be poured continuously as far as possible. Actually, if you look at this tower, you will see quite marked construction joints. For a tower of this height or a structure of this height, that would have been essential. But in all other situations, they would try and pour the concrete.
So what sort of time would have... 6 months?
No. You would be talking of less than 5 or 6 weeks.
5 to 6 weeks to build this 60-foot tower?
Yes.
That is quite incredible.
The towers controlled the heavy coastal gun batteries. But today, only their empty emplacements remain.
Well, we're in number 3 gun of West Battery, or Annis Battery as it later became called. There were 3 batteries on Alderney, medium batteries, and in conjunction with other batteries on the other Channel Islands and France, they were here to protect the passage between Cherbourg and Brest. This is a 15-centimetre battery, and it was a naval gun, and in fact the guns here were identical to the secondary armament on the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Each of these gun pits has an annular passage where all the ammunition was kept, and behind me here is a typical one of the 3 gun hoists which brought the ammunition up. Each of these gun pits had their own personnel bunker. As well as this, there was a large command bunker further down the cliff, which had a long base rangefinder. And as well as that, the whole position here was quite heavily fortified. There were several rings of barbed wire. Outside of this were mined. They had their own anti-aircraft guns here. They had flamethrowers, machine guns, and it was a very strong position.
Strategically, the islands were important if you consider them as offshore gun platforms. And in this respect, Guernsey was the most important, being the most westerly. This is one of the 4 gun sites making up Battery Mirrors, the largest coastal artillery battery in the Channel Islands. This was the center link battery, the 3 heavy batteries protecting the Bay of St. Malo, and hence the importance of Guernsey in the strategic plans of the Germans for these islands. The guns for this battery were 12-inch or 30.5 centimeter caliber, and taken from a Russian dreadnought of First World War vintage, the Alexander III, latterly named Volya, when with the White Russian fleet. The guns were eventually found by the Germans after the invasion of Norway and taken back to Krups for reconditioning. With the general shortage of heavy armament for coastal defence, they were naturally useful for the defence of the Channel Islands. To bring the guns here, of course, was a major undertaking. They had to be brought across France and shipped from St. Malo in wartime conditions to St. Peter Port, thence lifted by a special floating crane which had been brought to the island for the purpose, onto heavy 24-wheel transporters and towed by 4 or 5 half-tracks across the island to this site.
A wartime German newsreel shows a similar load being moved in the same fashion.
3, 4, 5. 5 schwere Zugmaschinen mussten für den Transport dieses stählernen Riesen eingesetzt werden.
The gun pits remained open for the duration of the war. The Navy resisted Hitler's attempts to casemate these batteries because they preferred to have a 360-degree field of fire. The accommodation behind the emplacement is fairly extensive, accommodating 68 crew and 4 officers with ammunition and cartridge stores and full air conditioning. The battery was controlled by radar and employed some of the most sophisticated shipboard fire control equipment in the Battery Command Center.
Entfernung 289. Eine Salve. Eine Salve. Salve. Arm.
Ungefähr Richtung 336 Grad 8. Protest. Feuern!
Ever fearful of Allied air raids, the Germans resorted to extensive tunnelling to shelter their stores and vital operations.
Colin, just how many tunnels did the Germans build in Guernsey?
Well, from the remaining documentation, we understand that they planned to build or excavate over 40 tunnels for various uses. In fact, they started work and completed up to 29. This is one of the smaller tunnels, in fact, the hospital tunnel complex being considerably larger than this.
This is particularly unique as it's actually under a church. What was it used for?
This particular tunnel was used for ammunition storage. The extent of the tunnelling in Jersey, Guernsey and Alderney was quite considerable and undertaken over a fairly short period, guided, of course, by special engineering mining units. This is the underground hospital, which was built at St Andrews and involved the excavation of almost 30,000 cubic metres of rock. For this purpose, naturally, large numbers of labour was required. The subject of slave labour, so-called, and the number of deaths which occurred during these operations has always been a delicate subject. No one denies that these workers suffered hardships and the ultimate penalty in constructing these tunnels. The figures are always likely to be contested. Nevertheless, the workings here are extensive, comprising 2 lateral tunnels linked by cross tunnels which were used for the underground hospital. Adjoining it is an equally large complex which was one of the major ammunition stores for the island. It's difficult to imagine today, when walking along these tunnels, that this was once a bustling medical centre. In fact, it was used only for a short while for that purpose, before and after D-Day, in the latter stages of the war. You have to try and imagine that there was some form of heating. Lighting was considerably brighter than it is today, and men would be accommodated here under difficult conditions, perhaps eventually under bombardment. And the use of it as a hospital must have been pretty depressing for those patients here.
While all this construction was underway, life for the many islanders who had stayed was growing increasingly difficult. And as food stocks ran low, queues formed for the most basic of commodities.
In the interim, we were living on our fat, and our stores were dwindling. Something had to be done. And the only way out was to request the Germans for permission to trade in France.
The occupiers kept an iron grip on civilian life, and notices in German and English forbidding or regulating activities now appeared everywhere. Even wireless sets had to be handed in.
It had an obvious effect on the morale of the public. Until that time, there had been freedom. I will be quite fair when I say that at no time was there any brutality in the early stages of the occupation. In fact, I'll probably be unpopular for saying it, but it could be described as a benign occupation.
The older Germans were, I think, more considerate, and they had families of their own. They quite liked the children too. And we remember particularly these two Germans that were living in my aunt's house. They approached my mother one day and they mentioned that they were going off to Russia. And because they were leaving the house, and they said to my mother, look, we found some nice photographs of your family, of the children, and we feel if future Germans may come into the house next week and they might destroy these photographs.
Germanising the islands was haphazard at best. Parishes on the Guernsey map were given German names, and German language lessons were compulsory in school. Driving on the right was introduced, and continental road signs and military marker posts were erected everywhere.
But it was a strange thing. There was no real fear because the town seemed to be operating normally. There were civilians walking about doing their daily work, and the Germans seemed to be mingling with them. They were armed, but there seemed no particular fear at that stage.
During the occupation, Frank Struban ran a restaurant in St. Peter Port, then called the Home from Home.
I refused to serve Germans at the start, and for about 3 weeks I got away with it. And one day a German officer came in and he said that he wanted me to feed his people. And I said, no, it's not possible. I haven't got the food. I said, you've got your own rations, so why should I provide you with food? He said, well, you either let them in or we shut you down. So I didn't have much choice, so I let them in. And that was where I was able to provide them with what I called, it was condemned ham, but it was called in German stinking Schinken. And stinking Schinken became a subject of the menu. And lo and behold, I would take out a plate. My staff wouldn't go near it. They said, no, this is your funeral. So I dealt with it myself. And lo and behold, they come back for more. I fully expected to find some corpses on my hand, but it seemed to agree with their digestion.
Island entertainment was limited to German military bands or the odd Amdram production. But local cinemas did remain open.
Once we got into the cinema at night, we had to sit one side and the Germans sat on the other. We were divided by a metal pole right down the middle. There was no smoking allowed, and I can remember the German field police patrolling up and down the aisles, looking up at the light from the projection room to see if they could see just a trace of cigarette smoke. And if they did, they'd pounce on that person and get them out.
Always there was a propaganda film. There'd always be a news film, and it was always to the benefit. It was always the Germans that were winning.
Auch Verbände der Waffen-SS sind vom Osten nach Frankreich verlegt worden. Am 29. Juli zog die Leibstandarte der SS Adolf Hitler in einem vielstündigen Marsch durch Paris auf den Champs-Élysées. Generalfeldmarschall von Rundstedt, der Oberbefehlshaber der Heeresgruppe West, grüßt die durchziehenden Truppen. Links SS-Obergruppenführer General der Waffen-SS Sepp Dietrich.
This particular night, my father just burst out laughing. Well, always at the cinema there was about always at least six Germans on guard at the exits doors. And of course they all spotted him and heard him and came up and fined him 10 marks on the spot. My father said, blow that, I won't go to the cinema anymore. We never did.
However, not all islanders knuckled down under German rule, and some even took to speaking in the local Guernsey patois to confound their occupiers.
Passive resistance took a form mainly amongst the men in the population of just ignoring the fact that they were there. Then we had the underground newspaper called Guns, Guernsey Underground News Service, it was called. And that was distributed to a few. It got very soon found out. And the people who were involved with it were sent to prison in Germany and had a very rough time.
To keep islanders in check, the Germans posted notices of civilian executions over in France and published wanted posters of their own military criminals. But the occupation's darkest day came with Hitler's order for the deportation of islanders to Germany, in reprisal for neutral Persia having handed over German technicians to Britain.
It came as a terrible shock to us to realise that I think it was 1,200 people was the number that was stated to be required, were to be taken out to absolutely unknown destination. For what? Certainly there was over 1,000 people taken from Guernsey and Jersey and sent to an internment camp. Let's get this quite straight. It wasn't concentration camp, it was internment camp.
June the 6th, 1944, and the long-awaited invasion of Europe as the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the combined D-Day assault on the French coast of Normandy. The British and Canadians took the beaches of Juno, Gold and Sword, whilst Americans fought ashore at Omaha and Utah, so heralding the beginning of the end for Hitler's Reich. The islanders thought they would be liberated next, but it was wounded Germans from the Battle for Normandy who began arriving in the islands for treatment in the converted underground hospitals. Now the islands started to echo to the sound of alarm bells as gun crews and flak batteries were constantly brought to readiness, as the German High Command waited for the inevitable onslaught, but it never came. And as the Allies slowly fought their way across Normandy towards the distant Rhine, the islands were bypassed and siege conditions began to set in. Instead of freedom, a grim winter of 1944-45 loomed on the horizon.
Our imports from France stopped. We had to live on our own fat, whatever we had in stock in the island, or we could produce. The Germans were very much in the same boat.
We all began to feel rather sorry for some of the Germans because they were getting very short of food come the end, and I can remember seeing them along the Gluttony Esplanade scooping up flour from the road, which had spilled from a Red Cross sack. So it was obvious that they were feeling the pinch because their communications with France had ceased.
We saw these Germans and Nazis too just change completely. We were the hungry ones, but the Germans then, by that time there was no cats left on the island. I mean, they'd eaten all the cats.
Eating carrageen moss was one way of surviving, and parsnip coffee and bramble tea also became makeshift foods as islanders desperately tried to ease their hunger.
Those 11 months were really tough. In fact, we were reduced to pretty nice starvation until such time as the Red Cross intervened.
The International Red Cross did arrange for the ship Vega to make 6 journeys to the island with Red Cross parcels and also quantities of flour.
These parcels virtually saved the lives, in my view, of hundreds of Guernsey people. They were a godsend.
The end of the war in Europe finally arrived in May 1945. And as the victorious Allies accepted the German surrender on the continent, the islanders eagerly awaited their turn for freedom.
It was on May the 8th that we heard that we could fly the flags and Guernsey was going to be liberated. So May the 8th, the Germans were still free, walking about, not very happy, mind you, but I can always remember this radio came out in the canishes on the windowsill, and there was a party of us, my family and friends, listening to Winston Churchill saying our dear Channel Islands going to be free. And that was when we really thought, well, this is it.
There was joy in the heart of everybody that sailed to Guernsey in the destroyer Bulldog to bring freedom to the Channel Islands. Off the coast, the destroyer anchored near to a rusty German minesweeper, from which came a representative of the enemy command. He was Lieutenant Zimmermann, a young man with all the most odious Nazi characteristics. He said he was not empowered to surrender, but only to discuss terms. When it was made clear that there would be no discussion, he returned to his ship for further orders. He had the audacity to hint that unless our destroyers withdrew until midnight, it might be the worse for them. The next German visitor to Bulldog was more sensible. With full power to sign unconditional surrender came Major General Heine. He was received by Brigadier Snow, and in a few minutes the Germans signed 8 copies of the document, some for Russia, some for America. After very nearly 5 years of German occupation, the Channel Islands were free.
We had been stranded here for 5 years, never knowing how the islands would be liberated.
There was a German garrison 10,000 strong on Guernsey, and there was a decided element of humor in the situation when a mere band of 30 British artillerymen went ashore to take over.
We were right in the front against this barricade, and then all of a sudden we saw these soldiers from the top of the harbour walking down, so smart, and all of a sudden the bubble burst and we ran. Oh dear, when we got there, it was wonderful.
It was a fantastic day. I don't think I shall ever forget it. The light in the eyes of the Guernsey people at the thought of being once again free and able to do just what they wanted.
It was strange, but there wasn't a German in sight. They had evidently been ordered into their barracks, and there they stayed to avoid any nasty incident.
At the old fortified Cornet Castle, the German guard was relieved of its duties. The ceremony was conducted according to military etiquette, which many people believe is a courtesy such an enemy as the German does not deserve. There's an enormous mass of military material in the Channel Islands, which were one of the most strongly fortified places in Europe. There was a small shooting affray just after the surrender. General Heine was interrogated at British headquarters, but the men concerned escaped arrest. Vice Admiral Hofmeyer, the German commander-in-chief, was soon on his way to an English prison camp. Thus ended the 5-year ordeal of the only British territory in Europe occupied by the enemy.
80 years on, Richard Hume, MBE, is still dedicated to keeping those occupation memories a living history.
This showcase contains a small selection of the militaria, which can be seen in the museum. Included is some interesting tunics, and one is a black panzer tunic. They had 17 large French tanks in the island, and this tunic was left in a house, and I was told from the person that the owner had actually committed suicide. Rather sad story, but each exhibit does have a story. This Field Gendarmerie gorget, which is a luminous, is worn by the field police of the day. The big plaque is from the memorial chapel, and the smaller shields also. Beautifully carved, we think by the same artist. There's also some beautiful carved bowls and daggers and dishes. The Navy was very prominent, largely because of the shipping in the Channel Islands, and they also manned the large, heavy coastal artillery batteries on the islands. And here's a naval petty officer's tunic and side cap, which was left in a local house. We also had Russian volunteers, mostly Georgians, and this tunic with the fur coat belonged to a German Georgian officer by the name of Hans Noroska. After liberation, the tunic and his papers were left. There's also a wide range of German helmets. Although they look all the same, there is German Luftwaffe with its prominent outstretched wing eagle. There's German marine artillery. There is also camouflaged helmets, medical, and of special interest to me is this particular helmet, which is the helmet of General von Schmettau, who was a German commander-in-chief in the Channel Islands from 1942 till January 1945. We also have in the museum a very interesting dagger, which is believed to be General von Schmettau's, and he left this dagger in the home of the Blucher family in Guernsey at Haviland Hall. And the late Count Blucher said that this dagger was to be given back to von Schmettau should he return to Guernsey. And in 1964 he did return, but no mention was made of the dagger to him.
As new generations visit the bailiwick of Guernsey, the last word back in 1990 rightfully went to Richard, and it still holds good today.
It is history, and if it's not preserved, then it's lost forever.